Bueno, buenos días a todos y a todos los que se han sumado hasta ahora y espero que más puedan encontrar el tiempo en medio del día para acompañarnos. Como en otras ediciones de Earth Speaker Series, vamos a grabar esta conversación, así que puede estar disponible también para el resto de la comunidad más adelante. Voy a cambiar a inglés, ¿verdad? Con esta edición en la que tenemos un invitado muy especial y muy valioso, con una perspectiva muy completa del continente africano. Así que vamos a cambiar ahora al inglés. Welcome, Acha. It's a privilege and an honor to have you with us today. As I was saying before, there's a number of people joining from our community. Even a board member is connected. Welcome, Adrian. It's good to see you. But more people will have access to a recording that we'll make available later on. It is for me a pleasure and an honor to have Acha. He's a dear friend. We were colleagues in 2008 of the class of young global leaders at the World Economic Forum, and in this more than a decade of knowing, Acha is a remarkable African leader, one with a global vision, but a heart completely connected to his home continent. He's the chair of McKinsey's Africa. And also member of McKinsey's Shareholders Council, which is the global governance board of the company. He has more than 2 decades of a career there. He's been very entrepreneurial there. He started offices in Lagos, in Nigeria. Now he's based in South Africa. He's also a member of the McKinsey Global Institute Council, and he's led the public and social sector practice in Africa as well. His clients and his contributions to governments, multinationals, and private sector, of course, have been remarkable. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford, also a master's in electrical engineering and industrial engineering from Stanford, and a bachelor of electrical engineering in Georgia Tech. Brilliant student, academic, but more important than that, I would say brilliant leader and a true believer in the power of leadership. He is a co-founder of the African Leadership Network, a network of current generation of African leaders who aspire to bring prosperity to the continent. He's been on the advisory council of the African Leadership Academy, an institution that is very close to Earth, and has served on the World Economic Forum as part of the Global Future Council on Economic Growth and the Global Agenda Council for Africa. I mean, among many other things. And very passionate believer in the need for Africa to get more integrated. So, Acha, a true pleasure, a true honor to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Arturo, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. So let me start with this. As you know, and as I've shared with you, at Earth, our students' mission is to change the world for the better. And I know personally that that's your motivation and your call as well, and in particular focus of course in Africa. So how does your work and your leadership from McKinsey allows you to do that? You know, how is that life as a top consultant globally and in the continent allow you to have an impact, to make important changes in the African continent?
Well, first I have to say I love your mission, right? I think it's a very powerful one. And to talk about, how mine allows me to do it at McKinsey, maybe I give you a bit of background of myself, right? Because I think that will give you some perspective as to why some of these things that are important to you are also important to me. So I was born in Cameroon, in Central Africa. I grew up in Canada. We moved to Canada when I was 6 months old. My parents went to school there. We then moved back to Cameroon because they wanted, at the time, these are parents who, once they finished studying overseas, they wanted to put those new skills to use for the benefit of the country. So we moved back to Cameroon. But the education system was not great. So I went to Belgium for high school and then to the US for university and grad school, like you said. And then I joined McKinsey. But while I was at Stanford, I decided I wanted to learn about consulting. And so the first time I worked at McKinsey was in South Africa as a summer. I spent the summer, actually winter in South Africa. But I spent with McKinsey. Then I went back and finished my PhD. But at the time, nobody was coming. This was the late 1990s. Nobody was moving back to Africa, right? even my parents were like, we didn't send you to the US to get this education for you to then come back to Africa, stay in the US, get a job, send money back home, and then come back when things are better. But I always had an issue with that because I always said, if those of us, and I know many students at the university probably, have similar experiences, if those of us who were fortunate enough to actually leave our countries and go experience the West, if we didn't come back to change things, how would things change? Right? And I always argue that it's our responsibility, and I even say our obligation, to actually change things in our home countries. And so that brought me back to the continent. I decided to test the waters. I came back, did some work while I was still in the US, I did some work in Uganda, did some work in Nigeria. And then I decided, you know what, I actually liked the work I did in McKinsey in the US, but I was just much more passionate about the work I did on the continent. And I said, let me transfer for 1 year. I said, I'll come and do 1 year and then I'll go back to the US. And South Africa at the time was the only office we had. So I transferred to the South Africa office for 1 year. And that was 19 years ago. And I never went back to the US, right? And I came here and I've been doing sort of helping lead our expansion across Africa. We now have 6 offices across the continent. I actually moved to Nigeria and spent 4 years there setting up the office in Nigeria and growing it. And then I'm back in South Africa, but I do a lot of work outside. All this to say, at the end of the day, for me, what's important is to make a difference on the continent. I was saying we'll come back to that. I think, it's important to understand your purpose in life. I really think my purpose, I think God, I'm Catholic, and I think God put me on this earth to help play a role in contributing to the economic rebirth of Africa. And I feel like the work I do at McKinsey is very aligned with that. So I do a lot of public sector work. So helping governments across the continent figure out how to transform the economies, how to grow scale, create more jobs, attract more investments. I do a lot of work in the social sector, so I work with some big foundations who are really trying to make a difference on the continent. So we spent the last year and a half, helping the continent come up with a continental response to the COVID crisis, right? And we can talk about that some more. And I do some work in the private sector as well, because I think it's important to actually build big African champions, big champions coming out of Africa. So I do a lot of work in service of the private sector companies, but I also do quite a bit of stuff outside of McKinsey. Right, so you talked about ALA. I founded ALA with Fred and a few others. We founded ALU now and ALN. And I feel like as a portfolio, I'm really living my purpose in life. Right? So that's important. So through the work I do at McKinsey, but also through work I do outside, I think I'm quite fortunate to really feel like every day I'm really living my purpose in life. And I think that's sort of what hopefully many of the students at the university will eventually get to.
Absolutely. I as always inspired to hear you, and indeed, I mean, it's exactly the same feelings, motivations that our students have, including the ones of going back home and contributing, right, through different means, and which I think why is also fascinating for me that someone with your profile from, of course, a global powerhouse like McKinsey can do so much good, which I know it can. It's just a great example to see. You mentioned COVID, and so it's very but it's a crucial juncture in human history, right? How is Africa doing, and what examples of African collaboration and can you maybe share with us that could also be learning from other regions like Latin America?
Yeah, no, actually, so we're doing okay. Right. The reality is when the crisis hit, we all did some projections for how badly the continent could be affected. We thought that GDP could actually contract by as much as 5%. We thought that about 150 million jobs were at risk, 50 million in the formal sector, 100 million in the informal sector. And the truth is we've been hit, but not as bad. Right. So GDP contracted by 2%, not 5%, by 2% last year. It's projected as a continent to grow by over 4% this year. We did lose some jobs, but we lost about 30 million jobs, not 150. Right? So it wasn't as bad. And part of it is because, we learned from what other regions did, and we closed our economies very early. Across most countries, close our economies very early. But, and I'm sure the same probably, in your region as well, which is in many of our countries, if people don't work, they can't eat that day. right? And so we were not able to keep our economies closed for too long, right? And so we had to really find a way to balance this whole health crisis and the economic crisis. And so overall, I think our governments actually did a decent job, and they had a lot of support from the private sector. So we're not as affected, right? If you look at number of cases are lower, but we're not testing enough. But the reality is number of deaths, our case fatality rate in Africa is about 2.8%, relative to sort of 4% in the world, right? So we're not seeing as many deaths. Now there's big questions about why that is, right? Is it because, we are the most youthful population in the world? The average African is 19, so that definitely contributed. But, are there things around, they talked about the BCG vaccine, they talked about the climate, right? Nobody really knows exactly why, but the truth is we're not as affected. Now, the challenge now is, as vaccinations start to increase around the world, we are the continent that has the lowest penetration of vaccination. Only 2% of Africans are vaccinated today, right? And that's really the challenge. And that's back to your question about collaboration we've seen. And we saw that first on the test kits. And, in the early days of the crisis, when people were looking for ventilators, for test kits, and we just couldn't find them because, the West was just grabbing and buying everything they could find. And we had individuals, so Africa, we talk about Africa, but it is 54 countries. So we had individual countries trying to go negotiate for some ventilators and test kits. And it's only when we came together as a continent, right, and said, look, let's try to negotiate as a continent, right? So we as McKinsey actually did the work to, try to identify how many ventilators do we have and how many ventilators may we need in Africa? How many test kits are we potentially going to need in Africa? We then did it for vaccines as well. What's it going to take to vaccinate 60% of Africans, right? What's it going to cost? And only when we then came together and under the African Union did an amazing job of saying, look, let's really try to, not the first time, but at least it doesn't happen very often, to have a really Pan-African response to the crisis. And so let's go and negotiate with China or negotiate with the US, but as Africa, not as individual countries. That's when people started coming to the table and we started to see, test kits and now vaccines flowing on the continent. So one of the big lessons we've learned is really the power of a unified voice coming out of Africa. And that's definitely something we're going to continue to see. We've talked about why it's important. We've seen it in different areas, but when it came to COVID, I think part of Africa's success in responding to it is the unified voice that we projected and that we use to negotiate some of these deals around the world.
Well, I'm very happy to hear. In Latin America, we haven't had any of that. Different histories, obviously, but something, and that's something around integration in a minute. Now, going back from COVID, or towards a new normal, of course, many of the structural problems we had before the pandemic are still there. You are, one of the top, 3 experts in the world about Africa. What in your mind are the key challenges for the continent? It's a young continent, a lot of potential, a lot of resources. What are the huge challenges that you and our graduates as African leaders need to address and change and transform?
I mean, as you can imagine, Africa has many challenges and people always talk about them. So, we'll talk about corruption, you'll talk about the infrastructure challenge, you'll talk about employment, right? But, we really believe that, and I firmly believe that at the crux of it all, Africa's biggest challenge is the challenge of leadership. And I know that that's what you're training at the university, right? If you go really dig deep and say, what is the root cause of all of this? Is a challenge of leadership. We just have not, in the past, and it's improving, but we're not there, had really good leaders who are here, selfless leaders who want to make a difference to the continent and to the people in the continent versus looking out for themselves. And as you know, in these countries, our regions where we don't have strong institutions, the impact that a good or a bad leader can make is massive. Right? When you're in the US and you have very strong institutions, you have a bad leader, you'll manage that person out over time, right? But in our markets, where not these strong institutions to keep these leaders in check, you have a bad leader and, it could drag you down for 10, 20, 30 years, right? And you have a good leader who can make all the difference. And that's why we, along with Fred, and, thanks again for the support and the strong partnership we have between ALA and Earth University, we said, we felt like the emergence of good leaders is too important to leave that emergence to chance, that, by chance we'll find some good leaders. We thought what's important is to actually create the kind of leaders Africa needs. And that's really the genesis for African Leadership Academy, where we then stepped back and said, let's really think through what kind of leaders does Africa need, ethical leaders, leaders who are entrepreneurial, because we're never going to have enough jobs for the people on the continent. We're going to have to create our own jobs, right? Leaders who really have a Pan-African perspective and don't think just about themselves or the country, but think about the continent. And that's what for the last, 10 to 15 years, we've been trying to build and create through ALA. But so I think, yes, we can talk about corruption, and we can talk about the infrastructure challenges, we can talk about the youth unemployment, which are all issues. But at the crux of it all, I think the real challenge Africa has in terms of leadership. And good leaders attract great leaders with them, right? So you have a good leader and they bring people along with them. They generally attract people who are probably smarter than them, right? They feel confident enough to attract those kinds of people. And they make a difference. And we've seen that in a few countries in Africa where, some good leaders have made a fundamental, so you look at whatever we saw President Kagame, but on the economic side, what he's done for Rwanda over the last, 15 years has been amazing, right? And you've seen Ngozi at the WTO, what she did as Minister of Finance in Nigeria, what Kaberuka did when he was president of African Development Bank. We've started to see the emergence of them. We just need them to be. You need many, many more of them across the continent.
I of course agree fully with you. And so you mentioned something about African integration relative to COVID and how it has been positive and valuable, and people are now perhaps perceiving more than in the past the value of that collaboration, that integration. Why do you think for other issues is that important? Because I of course, I'm not an expert in Africa, but knowing Latin America, there are countries here in this region that feel that we're ahead of the rest, so we don't really need to connect with others, and then some others who feel that they're so behind that if they connect with a larger group of countries, their own challenges will be overlooked. That they wouldn't be. So what's your take on why Africa as a continent, more than 50 countries, actually would gain from acting more of an as an African Union, like a more effective, more consistent, more constant African Union?
No, it's hugely important. I think people recognize that. So a few years ago, we signed a treaty, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the idea there is to create the biggest free trade area in the world, right? It's 1.2 billion people, it's 54 countries. Because at the end of the day, we have too many small countries. Right, and it'll be hard for those countries to really scale economically like they need to and create the jobs they need to without being part of a bigger group. And so, and it took a while for, you can imagine every country wants to do their own thing. Every country wants to build their own airline. Every country wants to, build their own car manufacturing plants. But the reality is, too many of them are just subscale and they'll never be successful. So how do we come together? And if we're negotiating with a China, with an India, with somebody, with a Brazil, how do you come together with a force of 1.2 billion people and have those negotiations? That's so much more powerful than coming as a country of 2 million people or even a country of 50 million people, right? And so, so eventually we, when President Kagame was the chair of the African Union, he was then able with the group to get everybody together. We've agreed on the AFCFTA. They ratified it, so 54 of Africa's 55 countries have ratified it now. The secretariat is up and running in Ghana. We're actually doing some work with them. But the first step is ratifying it. Now practically, how do you make it work? And the challenge was, I'll just give you two examples. One is intra-Africa trade. I don't know what the number is in Latin America, but trade within Africa today sits about 16 to 18%, right? In Europe, it's 60%. I'm sure in LATAM it's probably 20, 25%, right? So how do we get more trade going across within African countries? That's very important, right? And also because as Aliko Dangote, who's the richest Black man in the world, but also a very successful Nigerian industrialist, he always reminds us that when you import a product, you're exporting jobs. So the jobs are created somewhere else where the product is coming from, right? And one of the biggest issues the continent has is jobs, right? We just are not creating enough jobs for our people. And it's a ticking bomb, right? We're going to have the largest working force in the world, a population of working age in the world by 2035 or so, larger than India's, larger than China's. And so that is a big issue. How do we create jobs? So it's important to really promote intra-Africa trade. The second is, an example when we started this work actually with the World Economic Forum at the time, we realized even for Africans to travel across Africa. So I'm from Cameroon. I have a Cameroonian passport. On average, an African needed visas to travel to 60% of African countries, right? A European needed visas for 55% of African countries. An American needed visas for 42%. So it was easier for an American or European to travel across Africa than it was for us to travel around the continent. And at the time when we started this work, which is about 6-7 years ago now, there were only 5 countries in Africa where you could just show up and you could get a visa on arrival, or you didn't need a visa in Africa. So we've done a lot of work and promoting and making the case. And so today we are about 27 countries that allow Africa, about half of African countries now you can show up and get a visa on arrival for an African, right? So we're making progress there. Those are all little things that were getting in the way of intra-Africa trade. So it's very important for us to actually put that in place. But now that it's in place, the question, how do you make it work in practice? How do you make it such that, when there's a truck that leaves from Lagos and is driving all the way west to, say, Dakar in Senegal, that they don't have to pay duties at every single border, right? So those are the kind of practical things. I'll give you another example, COVID vaccines, right? So how do you make sure, there's 54 countries, every country had its own different process to accreditate and say this vaccine is acceptable for my country. If you follow that process, it'll take forever. Some countries will take a while, some won't. So we actually did some work with the Africa CDC to say, what is a continental process to say, let's trust a continental body to say this vaccine is good for Africa, and then let's get all the countries to just apply that, right? And so you can go down the path to the many, many things like that. Payments, how do you do cross-border transfers and payments? You have different currencies across the continent. What do you do to facilitate that? So all those are very important things. At the end of the day, this is what's going to drive even faster GDP growth across the continent. And it's going to drive even faster sort of, increase in disposable income for our people, which is what we need.
Absolutely, and I would even add that you mentioned corruption at the beginning, and when you take these more regional institutions, at least it's a fresh start, right? I mean, you can at least give it a you take some processes like, let's say, the CDC, right? Some approvals and some things, at least start to a regional level, and that give you a new start. The opportunity to create regional institutions for sure. So before we open, there's a number of questions in the Q&A section. The IPCC just issued a report 2 days ago about climate change. I think there's nothing new really. I mean, basically saying that everything we knew is true, and that given that we haven't met the goals we have set for the planet up until now, of course, we're not at this point, aiming at the 1.5 degree, but rather much higher. So what's the role of Africa in that? How do you see climate change as relevant in Africa's future?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely critical for the continent, but it's also not an easy solution, right? Because if you talk to some people on the continent, they'll say, look, you know what, the West, grew on the back of some of these, less clean type energies, and they're able to now develop. And now, as we are going through the process, they're trying to put these constraints on us, right? I think with COVID, what has happened is countries have to rethink their economic growth plans, and we've been supporting a number of countries as they develop those. And so it's natural now to say, okay, how do we integrate the whole sustainability angle from the beginning, right? In the past, countries said, we have our plans, now you want us to adjust them, but now that you have to rethink them anyhow. And what's happening, around the world, and you're starting to see some of the impacts even on agriculture in Africa and some of the droughts. And, so you say, okay, we need to take this more seriously. So I think one point is our governments are taking it more seriously, very clear. The second point is we are starting to be under more pressure. So globally, some banks are now saying, we're not going to fund, some, dirty fossil fuels by X date. So you need to figure out what the plan is. So you're starting to see some pressure from an investment perspective to start to push around the world, not just in Africa, to go through that transition, right? So I think that's a good pressure. But also at the end of the day, people are saying, look, you know what? This, in some cases, it could be theoretical, but a practical answer is if somebody in a rural village, has two options, right? They have an option of a coal-fired plant to provide them electricity, or the option, or no electricity at all. What would you do, right? And those are not easy calls to make, right? Would you rather they not have electricity, or would you rather say, you know what, the electricity, all the benefits of electricity, kids being able to learn at night, go to school, people not being able to cook in a much more safe environment, all these benefits that we all know. Is it better to have a, coal-fired plant providing electricity for you or no electricity at all, right? So those are some of the trade-offs that we need to make. But the good news is through some of the pressures that are being created globally, through, the impetus of the crisis, which has now forced governments to really think through the economic growth and economic recovery plans, it's starting to get much more attention and being more integrated up front. But let's not lose sight of some of these fundamental trade-offs that need to be made, and that both our governments are going to have to make, and the private sector is going to have to make as well.
For sure. So let me move to some questions that they are connected. Obviously, as you can imagine, a professor of ours is asking a question about working with governments, and specifically how have your experience been supporting governments in Africa in general? But I imagine there are a number of dimensions that you can address.
Yeah, no, so I, as you said, I used to lead our public sector practice. So I do probably 60% of the work I do as in McKinsey's public sector. To give you a sense, globally, about 10% of the work we do is public sector, but in Africa, it's probably more like 30%, because we believe that you can't really help transform a place like Africa without really serving the public sector, right? In the US and Europe, you can serve the big corporates and make a big difference that way. In our markets, and I'm sure it's the same in LATAM, you need to actually serve the public sector to really transform these economies. So we do a lot of that kind of work. And what have I learned? One is it's not easy. It's not easy to serve the public sector. It's one of those where the impact is amazing. I always say the probability for impact, is low, right? And so really picking who you're going to partner with is very important. We've actually, been burnt in South Africa by partnering with the wrong people. So we're very, very careful about who we partner with, but also picking and working with people who really want to see impact. Hence, when I started with the right set of leaders, right? We want to work with leaders who are not just going to say, yes, I hired McKinsey and I paid McKinsey this much. Is, if we do some work for you and you don't implement it, it's a waste of your money and a waste of my time. So really thinking through, who are these leaders who really want to make a difference and who are able to make a difference in their economies, and how do we then accompany and serve them. But the biggest lesson for me is the biggest challenge in the public sector is the challenge of execution, right? We all of our leaders, they have visions, they have strategies. I've worked on a number of strategies for countries, but where the rubber hits the road is on execution, right? And the biggest challenge we have across the public sector in Africa, but I would argue it's around the world, it's an issue of execution. How do you really take all these visions and then how do you drive it? And what we've learned is taking a playbook from the private sector, right? In the private sector, there's a target, they measure, they track, there's consequence management. If you don't deliver, something could happen, you could get fired. And to bring a bit of that, private sector edge to the public sector is important. And so we feel, those countries have been the most successful. And there are countries, Rwanda has been very successful on execution. Ethiopia has actually done a very good job at execution. Got Cote d'Ivoire in the last 10 years, what they've done in executing some of the big infrastructure programs. Morocco has actually done a really good job. Even Senegal, on the back of this Plan Sénégal Émergent, the economic growth plan, which we helped them develop, have really executed on it. And it's about getting small cities, like creating these delivery units, right? A set of people with, who are a combination of public and private sector people who understand the public sector and how you actually get stuff done in the public sector, because it is very, very different. But also people who come with a private sector mindset who actually want to make a difference. And then it's regular tracking. In Togo, we have every 3 months, we have a government retreat with the president, the prime minister, all the ministers every 3 months, and we go through all the projects, the priority projects. We see where we are. We just did that 2 weeks ago. And we spent 2 days, right? We're there. We're going to do it again in 3 months. And then that puts a bit of pressure also on, the different ministers to make sure they can deliver, because they don't want to be the one to come and say, oh, my project is on red, right? And here's why. So it puts pressure on them and then on the whole system to deliver. So the ways to actually get execution going. But my big lesson on the government front is execution. My other big lesson, though, is that you can actually work with the public sector according to your values. Because everybody said, oh, if you're going to work with the public sector, then you have to be corrupt, you have to pay. And the reality is you don't have to, right? We don't. There's no way we can do it, right? And people respect that, right? You need to make sure there's enough influence for you to get paid when you need to get paid, right? But you can absolutely work according to your values. And my anecdote on that is in Nigeria, when we set up the office, we needed work permits for the foreigners who were in the country. And so the first time we submitted all the paperwork for the work permit, we waited 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, the paperwork was not coming out. And of course, somebody came and said, hey, look, you know what, if you facilitate, we can try to get it out faster. And I was like, even if I wanted to do it, I don't know how to, right? There's no way I can. And then eventually we got the work permits. And then after that, every time we actually applied for work permits, they came out very quickly. And we really believe that what happened in that office, they said, oh, this is McKinsey again, they're never going to pay. Just give them the work permits and then go deal with somebody else, right? So my lesson was, you stick to your values and you can actually serve the public sector according to your values.
Well, you read my mind. I was going to follow up with that because that's, of course, one inevitable thought, right, in working with the public sector. That's a great anecdote. I do imagine that your size, McKinsey helped, but you're right. I mean, in the end, it is, stick to your values, and some will be difficult, some will be an eventually path will open. There's another question.
Let me just quickly on that, because I agree, size matters, and that's also my lesson to the public sector leaders that I work with. I'm like, if you don't pay McKinsey, after 6 months, we're not going to crumble. It's fine, it's not great, but we'll still survive. But you have these SMEs that are doing work for you. You don't pay them after 6 or 9 months. Of course, somebody comes and says, "Hey, look, you know what? If you want to get paid, give me a 30% cut. I'll make it happen for you." They'll be tempted because they actually need the money, or they're desperate for the money, right? And so part of it is also the public sector with the processes. In some cases, they're actually encouraging some of these behaviors that we're all trying to stop.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. There is a question from Isaiah about specifically if you are part of or have an alumni association, I imagine related to either Stanford or Georgia Tech in Africa. And the question comes from, if you have one, on what body have you registered? Because as per graduates, we're looking for an official body to work as a team. In other words, your experience as alum, as an alum of these two great universities, as our graduates are trying to get more organized in Africa.
So I think, so there are these associations, right? We have a strong alumni association, for example, ALA. We have a very strong alumni community for ALA, and we actually get them together on a regular basis, and they serve as mentors and sponsors for the younger folks who are graduating. The Stanford has an alumni association in different places. In South Africa, they have one. In Nigeria, they do. Georgia Tech does not really, right? But we actually think there's a huge power in alumni associations. There's a huge power. There's an experience you've been through. You're spending 4 years together or more in an environment, learning, getting to know each other, especially at those formative years, and then coming back and trying to say, what can we do as a group together, right? Whether we'll do it because, in ALA, what we encourage the alums to do there is to say, we want all of you alums to sponsor one kid every year. Costs $30,000, right? And it's been great. So the alums have come together and they've put a bit of money here and there, and every year they sponsor a student, right? And I think it's great. And eventually, some will sponsor more as they grow, and and earnings grow for them, right? But at least it starts to give them the mentality of giving back, and that's part of what I think is important in everything we do. Is like I started by saying, one of my big lessons from the whole crisis is how incredibly blessed we are. Right? We are incredibly blessed. I think everybody at Earth University, everybody I work with, right, incredibly blessed, right? And as a result of that, I always say, to those whom much is given, much is expected of them. And so thinking through what can I give back, whether it's through the Alumni Association, how can I help, whether it's through, some other things you're going to do on the side, but really thinking through, what am I going to do to give back, and because people need it, even more than you needed it, right? And when you think about it, my message is always, think bold, right? Thinking about I'm going to give back and sponsor one kid at my village, my cousin in the village, that's fine. But because we've been so blessed, and also you've been incredibly successful, you'll be even more successful. Think about what are the kind of things that people could not do. What are these big problems that people that we need to solve? And it's easy to blame governments and blame others for these problems. What are some of these big problems, and how can I contribute to helping address it?
Thank you for that. There is a question, a personal question perhaps. What has been your greatest challenge? And you have described, of course, an incredibly successful career, but what have been your greatest challenge or challenges?
Well, I mean, there's, we can spend all night talking about challenges. We talk about success, but we've all gone through a number of challenges. I mean, for me, there's been the price to pay to do the work I do. Like I said, I really think my purpose in life is to help transform the continent. But it comes at a price, right? It's 54 countries. I used to travel all the time. I traveled basically every week for 14, 15 years. COVID has actually helped, right? Because you couldn't travel, but people now got very comfortable with Zoom, right? In the past, our tour would have been like, oh, when can you come, come to Latin America to speak to the students? Now we can do this over Zoom, right? So that's helping. But I mean, lifestyle has always been, a bit of a challenge. How do you manage it and still be there for family, for friends? And there, for me, the answer is you have to figure out what your boundaries are, right? And set some clear boundaries and know what works for you and what doesn't work for you. But that has been a challenge. And there's been a number of challenges, at work, trying to set up the office in Nigeria. You can only imagine all the challenges we went through trying to set up the office in Nigeria, trying to serve some clients you really want to serve, or trying to convince clients to do the right thing. But again, there for me, the message is, keep your eye on the prize. Be clear on why are you doing this, and what will be the outcome if you're successful, or once you're successful. Right? If you keep your eye on the prize, then you'll have to figure out how to deal with these challenges, and so that's one. And the third for me has always been, trying to advise some of these senior African leaders in a context where I felt I was a bit too young to advise them. Right? Who am I to advise Ngozi when she was Minister of Finance in Nigeria? Who was I to advise, President Kabiruka when he was President of Achankengs Bank? And then, then I realized it was a mindset issue, right? I felt I was, too young, and I probably would not, have anything, smart or insightful to share with them. And I realized over time that, they also need somebody who will be objective and honest with them, right? Everybody at the top tends to be lonely, by the way. Everybody at the top tends to be lonely. And they don't have many people who tell them the truth. They have a lot of people who tell them what they think they want to hear. They think they want to hear. They don't have many people who tell them the truth. So positioning myself, at least as somebody else, I'll always tell you the truth. You may not agree with it, you may not like it, but I'll always tell it to you. I'll tell you in a respectful way. And I know when to tell it to you, when to push back on you, maybe not when your staff is with you, maybe more it's one-on-one, finding that balance. But I realized that, they needed the help, and then figure out, how I can help them and how I can overcome some of my mindset issues. And it's been a great relationship with both of them and many other, people who are much more senior than me, with who I've realized have come to value my input.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you something more specific to food systems and agriculture. That's kind of our focus, as you know. So how do you see Africa in that? Because of course, we talk about that the continent can be the breadbasket of the world, and but at the same time, people living in poverty are pretty much, you found them in rural areas and in agriculture, right? So how do you see the future of that? And this year we have the UN Global Food Summit for the first time ever. What do you see the role of Africa should be there?
Well, like you said, I mean, I think Africa definitely has the potential, as we all know, to be the breadbasket of the world. But like, Lamido Sanusi, when he was central bank governor in Nigeria, he always said, you don't eat potential, right? Yeah, we can talk about potential, but you don't eat it. How do you actually realize that potential? And the truth is, we've not realized the potential yet, right? And again, it's Africa as a country. Again, I've done enough ag work, but I'm not the ag expert, right? So I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But the big challenge we found here is a challenge of, is yields, right? We just don't, we're just not, the yields are way too low across many of these ag products, right? All these commodities, whatever you name it, our yields are way too low. And so there've been a number of programs, and you've seen some successful programs. Babangonan in Nigeria has been one, where they've been able to triple yield for some of these smallholder farmers. And there are a number of such programs in different countries. The question is, how do you do that at scale and across the continent, right? So very excited to hear about the UN Food Summit. I didn't know about that, right? I think on the continent, what's happening is, what you're finding is many different countries are starting to take it more seriously, right? Because what the issue was, and President Adesina, who's president of African Development Bank, when he was the Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, that was his big push. He was like, the next billionaire from Nigeria should come from agriculture. So agriculture was not seen as some place where you can actually be successful and be commercially and actually make money. It was for those in the rural areas who couldn't make it to the city. And he really wanted to change the mindset and started this program called the Nagropreneurs, so entrepreneurs in agriculture in Nigeria. And that has actually taken off. So you're starting to see, even using technology, you're starting to see a number of companies, grow Sarah Menka and Grow Intelligence using data analytics in the agriculture sector. You're seeing Twiga Foods in Kenya and a number of other companies like that, Cellulant as well. A number of the companies are actually using technology to really help us address some of these challenges. Again, I think this is great. But the question, for Africa is, how do you scale it like anything else, right? You'll find interesting interventions in different countries. But what we've not been able to do is really, how do you scale this at a continental level, which is what is needed.
I'm sure you know Omid Kasiri, right?
I was in Kenya with Omid. I just got back from Kenya today.
Yeah, well, he came to visit a couple of years ago, and he came for a few hours to stay overnight, and because he has one of those has ideas for one of those issues, the scaling up, which of course, if you keep at so minimum scale, it's really hard to find economies of scale of many things, and of course, yields and productivity in general is really hampered. And yeah, we need to be agropreneurs. I love the term, and that's definitely what we need. So Isaiah, again, he's trying to, I think he's interested in creating this Earth Graduates Network. And he mentions if there is a way that you can register an association across the continent, maybe not country by country, but somewhat. He mentions that if there is any way you can register associations like at the African Union or in a way that it's continental, not national, is I think the question.
And that's a bit harder to do now, but those are kind of the challenges around 54 countries. Right. So if you have, so generally now, if it's just an association, there are Pan-African institutions that are sort of, part of the AU. Africa CDC is one. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is another one. So the number of Pan-African institutions. If you just want to register a business, for example, today, you need to go to different countries. And that's actually a good place to say, well, how can we get to a point, maybe through CFTA, to say we register once, and then it's valid across all these countries, so we don't have to go, because what happens is the requirements tend to be different across the different countries. So you go to one country and they ask you for X, Y, Z, and you go to another country and ask you for something else, right? And that's why digital has been hugely important, and it's taking off massively across Africa, because that is a quick way to scale across the continent, right? You will still need to register at some point in these countries. But to answer your question directly, I think right now, you'll be hard pressed to find somewhere where you can go and register an institution for the continent. So typically what you do, you'll start with what are the countries I want to really focus on and register there. But I like the push to say, can we get to a point where one day you will to register one institution, a Pan-African institution, and then it will be, automatically registered across the continent.
Yeah, that would be great. So Isaiah, some patience, but that's definitely part of what the aspiration should be, right?
Mm.
So Acha, you've mentioned leadership several times. You gave us a number of anecdotes and examples of your own leadership. You've been, of course, at the heart and the foundation of ALA, ALU, and we're connected actually, right? And what's a message you would leave our students and graduates? Also, we have faculty and board members connected. You know, you have already given us a number of messages, but what would be a send of message that you leave us with?
My big message, and what I tell to sort of, young folks I talk to these days, or young folks, I sound like I'm old now, but it's important to figure out your purpose in life. It's important to figure your purpose in life. And I always say, there's one question I ask myself every day, and it guides my life, it guides everything I do. And that question is, would it have mattered to Africa that I lived? Would it have mattered to Africa that I lived? Right? And I'm very clear that I want that answer to be yes. And so everything I do, the work I do at McKinsey, the opportunities I agree to take on at McKinsey, those I actually say no to, right? They've offered me jobs that were, beyond Africa. And I said, honestly, thank you for that offer. It's great, but I'm mostly interested in Africa, right? So I've actually limited the scope of what I'm interested in doing. And I'm very comfortable with that, right? But so I think it's important, and it'll take a process. When I was, in university, I can tell you, I didn't know what my purpose in life was. I could not tell you this way. I'm very clear on it now. But my message is really take the time to really go through the process, thinking through now that you're, all the things you're learning, the people you're working with, you're interacting with. What is your purpose in life? I mean, because once you do that, you'll be a lot clearer on what you want to accomplish and the path you want to follow. Now, that path is not going to be linear. It's definitely not going to be linear. Right? There'll be ups and downs and, twists and turns. But at the end of the day, you'll be clear on where you're headed and how whatever decision you make is helping you achieve that purpose in life. So my big message is figure out your purpose in life, one. And then the second one I'll leave you with is what I talked about already, is think through, what difference are you going to make to people around you? Right, we've been incredibly blessed to be at Earth University. How are you going to pay that forward? And what difference are you going to make?
I thank you for that. I mean, I admire both the purpose-driven life, but also your discipline, as you described it, right? I mean, to stick to that, and there are temptations in life, so sometimes it's not easy. So thank you for that. Just a final couple of thoughts. One is that there is a request for your contact info, and I guess we have your email, and we can perhaps share.
Yeah, you have it. Please share it. Absolutely, please share it with the group. Yeah. How many African students do you have, by the way?
So we have right now 440 on campus. We graduate about 100 plus every year. Total of more than 2,500 graduates. Several hundred already in Africa. In the past 20 years, they've been a good percentage. 5 years ago, we made the commitment to keep the percentage of African students at 20%. So we will keep working to never have less than that, because the African-Latin America connection has been amazing. It is powerful.
Oh my gosh, yeah, then we definitely should have an alumni association in Africa. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, it's kind of a commercial, but I'll share with you information about something we started this year, a fellowship program. And we have 19 fellows this year, and we have placed them in key partners around Africa as a ways for them to jumpstart their careers for impact. And it's been, it's academic institutions, for-profit companies, NGOs, some government institutions. So I shared that info with you. It's a bit of a commercial in the sense that for the next years, maybe somebody might land a fellowship at McKinsey. You have incredible work in so many things that our graduates are interested in. So I'll share that with you as well, because it's.
Please do. We're doing a lot of agriculture work. We're doing a lot of agriculture work across the continent. So please share it with me. I think my colleagues will be very excited to engage on that.
Exactly, exactly. Wonderful. Asha, thank you so much. I know it's nighttime for you. Thank you for the time, for connecting. And thank you for everyone who connected today. And we'll share with you a recording for your approval to be shared as for the rest of the community.
Absolutely. And thanks for the invitation. And looking forward to seeing you again in person soon.
I hope so too. I hope maybe
to visiting.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Maybe here. We'll see.
All right.
Have a great night, a great evening. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.